privilege for me to be here. I was so flattered when James invited me, and I felt like I immediately needed to say yes to this invitation, even though it comes at a very busy time in the academic cycle, and I had to kind of finagle getting released from everything else that I was doing to get over here. But it was a very special professional opportunity to work with Mariano, and I felt like I couldn't possibly not accept an invitation to speak at a conference in his honor. I will tell you in a sort of self-effacing way, if you will, that the presentation that I want to give tonight is loosely based on a chapter that Mariano didn't want to put in the Oracles of Science. Mariano, as we all know, was very rigorous in his thinking, and I wanted to put a kind of a speculative chapter sort of at the end, kind of talking about kind of the large-scale cultural influences and so on, and how these oracles of science were creating stresses in evangelicalism. And he didn't disagree with the ideas, but he thought that this would take the book away from something that was rigorous and scholarly and kind of speaking for itself, and kind of move the voice out of that literature into our own voice. And so this was an idea which I've been exploring sort of since Oracles of Science, and have published a couple of things on it. It's sort of in the category, I guess, maybe in a conference that has ontology and metaphysics in the title. This is very much a warm-up sort of act, because this isn't going to be too deep. But it comes out of my reflection on what I call intellectual trickle-down. I mean, I'm very interested in how ideas get out of the academy and into the pew. And we have students at our evangelical colleges that come up and they talk to you after you've lectured on evolution, and they have particular ideas that they got somewhere. And it's not always clear exactly how those ideas get from the academy, where they originate, through the various channels of communication, and then kind of show up in the mind of some 18-year-old who's taking a freshman philosophy course. So I've thought a lot about how that works. I don't have any good final answers to it, but I want to talk a little bit about how that process works, and how I think, and this is a very American perspective on this question, although my guess is it's a similar phenomena over here, but sort of tempered by the absence of a aggressive religious right political movement, that this doesn't work very well. It's a very, very flawed process by which the ideas trickle down, and as a result we find ourselves in the States mired in an endless debate over what we're going to teach our high school kids about evolution and other topics related to origins. So what I want to look at, I think, maybe would fall under the broad umbrella of sociology, and I want to make the point particularly that the so-called new atheists, that include Richard Dawkins and some others, are not really making what I would call a strong anti-religious argument when you look at it in just the right way, but rather what they are doing is they're trying to replace conventional religion with a scientism. And I think that there's a lot of kind of pro-religious rhetoric in their books, but this rhetoric is always aimed at dismantling and removing the content of traditional religion and replacing it with their view of science, when the familiar term that we give to that is scientism. Now this book by Richard Dawkins is, of course, the most famous example, and kind of launched, I think, the so-called New Atheist movement. And there's been a whole host of books since then by people like Dan Dennett and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens, and then responses to those, and then responses to the responses. These intellectuals, when they write a book like The God Delusion, exert enormous cultural influence, and this conversation has taken off in the States, and there's a lot of discussion now of atheism in a very broad cultural context. It's certainly not in the academy anymore. And so there's this kind of set of important thinkers, the ones that Marianne and I ended up exploring in Oracles of Science, that function in essence as a kind of public face of science, so that when somebody who is not a scientist and is not a scholar is thinking to themselves, okay, science, like what do scientists do? Who are the scientists? What kind of things do they say and write about? In many cases, I'm convinced that someone like a Richard Dawkins, who you see often on public television and so on, is very, very likely to be the model that you are using to represent science. Prospect Magazine called him the #1 public intellectual in the English-speaking world a couple of years ago. Very, very influential. His public persona in the United States is very much a caricature. He's known as nothing other than an anti-religious zealot. All of his sort of great work popularizing legitimate science is completely overlooked. But in the United States, at least, he's an enthusiast for anti-religion. He's very interesting in being a member of these two august societies, a literary society and a scientific society. There are very, very few people that can claim membership in both of those. And so this is a testimony to his great powers as a communicator, that he gets to rub shoulders with J.K. Rowling and sign his name with Charles Dickens' quill pen when the Royal Society of Literature meets. So this makes Dawkins, and I think this is a very good metaphor to use here, a central and even definitive figure in what John Brockman calls the third culture, which is a term that goes back to C.P. Snow. And C.P. Snow, I think as you probably remember, wrote a very seminal volume based on a lecture a few years ago called The Two Cultures. Snow was a chemist, and as a chemist he participated in the scientific community, but then he also wrote some works of fiction that got him some literary acclaim, and he found himself living in two different worlds, going to two different kinds of parties, being invited to be interviewed by two different types of journalists, and so on. And he was very, very struck by how separated these two cultures were from each other. The literary world and the science world seemed to have no overlap. And in particular, he was struck by the sneering condescension of the literary crowd. They considered themselves to be the inheritors of the intellectual tradition. They were the intellectuals, and the scientists were just looked upon as practitioners of a certain set of applied arts, pretty ignorant for the most part. And he was kind of horrified as he thought about what this meant for a democracy, that if you have the most effective communicators in your culture don't understand or have any contact with the source of many of the most important ideas that you have to wrestle with, what does that say for the kind of decisions that are likely to be made at the highest levels? And he has this very interesting anecdote about being at a party where some literary person was kind of sneering at the scientific community because they couldn't quote Shakespeare and they didn't value reading great novels and so on. And he silenced the group by asking how many of you can state the second law of thermodynamics. And not only could they not state it, they thought that this was kind of Philistine of him to even ask such a question among a gathering of intellectuals. And he went on to say that he felt like he could have asked any elementary question whatsoever about science, like what is mass, for example, or what is force, and they would have had absolutely no idea. And so he marveled in a very articulate way about how all of this great edifice of modern science had been built over the past couple of centuries, and yet these particular intellectuals don't understand it any better than their Neolithic ancestors would have. And how can this be there? So he felt like this problem was too important to go perennially unsolved, and so he predicted that there would be a third culture intellectual that would emerge, a particular type of communicator who would take the time to learn science, and in so doing be able to communicate the grandeur of the scientific story and make people interested in that. He anticipated that this divide would be bridged when somebody who knew how to communicate well would learn science. I think he felt perhaps that the communication was the harder part and the science was the easier part. But it turned out to be the other way around. And most of the people that are doing this most of these third culture intellectuals are scientists who have a gift for writing. Now, there are certainly some exceptions. I mean, Timothy Ferris and David Sobel and so on come to mind. But for the most part, if you go to a bookstore and you go to the science section, you look at the really good books that explain science to lay people, they're written by scientists, and in many cases written by scientists who are not merely trained in science, but have made important contributions to science as well. So these intellectuals who step forth and say, we will articulate science to popular audiences, they serve as gatekeepers, as bridges from the scientific community to the popular reader. So the question that Mariano and I wanted to explore in Oracle of Science is we wanted to say, well, how does this work exactly? Like, who are these public figures? What exactly is their influence? And what is the face of science that is portrayed in their writings? Somebody who is simply an honest intellectual who might wander into a bookstore and get the manager, if the manager is over 50 and actually reads books, to take them and show them some good books which they might read to learn about science. What would they walk out of the store with and begin to read? So we decided to profile the 6 scientists that we would argue, and of course anytime you make a list like this, you can certainly argue that someone should be on the list and someone that's on the list should not be there, but we think that it is defensible to make the claim that the 6 individuals that we profile in the Oracles of Science have done the most to shape the English-speaking world's concept of science over the past quarter century or so. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to argue that too vigorously, but I think it's at least defensible that these are the 6 key people. So these 6 scientists, and we decided this when we were looking at this that we wanted to rule out people who were effective communicators about science but were actually outside the scientific community themselves. And so Dan Dennett, who could be on a list like this, got ruled out by that criteria. So our list included Richard Dawkins, of course, who we all know and love. Stephen Hawking, certainly very well known. Stephen Jay Gould. I don't know what his stature was here in the UK, but in the United States he is considered to be one of the premier essayists that the country has produced in the past half century. E.O. Wilson, who's turning 80 in about 3 weeks. Steven Weinberg, who holds a Nobel Prize for some work on fundamental physics, and Carl Sagan. Sagan has been dead for a while, but his work lives on, and every so often somebody finds something brand new and unpublished, or they update something old and republish it, and so his influence continues today, and his books are still very much in print. Now, these guys are all what we would call public intellectuals, but they started out as scientists. Okay, none of them started out to become so well known that they would become celebrities. They started out as scientists, and then they made their way into the public eye. Now, this is an interesting question. Like, how does this happen? Like, what's the process by which you go from being an obscure but bright guy with a PhD at Oxford or Harvard University, and then you somehow end up being able to appear as Carl Sagan often did on the Johnny Carson show. Now, Carl Sagan was invited first as a relative unknown to comment on some scientific development. He was articulate and funny, so he was invited back to articulate once again. And pretty soon he was asked to comment on things that were completely outside of his field, and some breakthrough in biology would occur, and they bring the astronomer Carl Sagan back on to talk about it. This produced great resentment on the part of his colleagues. They were very jealous, and there's evidence that this resentment was the reason why he didn't get tenure at Harvard, despite having a lot of publications. But he gradually became the single most important spokesperson for science in the United States. And by the time he had finished with his Cosmos series on public television, Carl Sagan had become the most recognizable person on the planet. He was, someone had done some data where they were taking pictures of him, and you could take a photograph of him to just about any city in the world that had television, And in the local accent, they would say, "Oh, that's Carl Sagan there." So extremely well-recognized personality. And of course, this shows in many ways the universality of science. Compared to, say, baseball. A famous baseball player might be well known in countries that care about baseball, but perhaps not here in England when you watch cricket. So Carl Sagan becomes a public intellectual, so well known that when he writes his first novel, Contact, he gets a $2 million advance, largest advance in history for a first work of fiction. And you can see that the publisher felt that his name was at least as important in selling the book as the title of the book. This is kind of in contrast to the size of our names down here compared to the title there. So Sagan has enormous influence, and so this book sells very well. It becomes a major motion picture with Jodie Foster. Many of Carl Sagan's thoughtful philosophical ideas show up in dialogue in the screenplay and so on. There's conversations in there about the nature of belief in God and so on that are quite interesting and quite sophisticated for movies made in Hollywood. He is a genuine celebrity scientist. So I think in a similar, analogous, but less significant way, all of the oracles of science sort of move into the public eye in a way that's sort of like what Carl Sagan did. Now, Sagan got started because of the Johnny Carson show, and Johnny Carson used to be the kind of the referee of cultural relevance in the United States. If you could get on Carson, then you must be relevant. There is no natural successor to Carson. Jay Leno and Letterman, some people say Oprah is our new referee, but there's no clear successor. But I would like to suggest that one way you can tell that you are genuinely relevant is if your ideas or a caricatured version of yourself actually appear on Fox Network's long-running program, The Simpsons. Everything of interest in American culture gets satirized and sent up with great humor in The Simpsons. For those of you who don't watch it regularly, you may have not seen Stephen Hawking there several times. He's made multiple appearances, sometimes explaining esoteric things about black holes and so on. He has a spring-loaded boxing glove in his wheelchair that he can use to punch Homer when he wants to, and then a little propeller that carries him away when he's tired of talking with The Simpsons. Stephen Jay Gould appeared in an episode of The Simpsons that was actually exploring an idea, again in Simpson-esque way, of the non-overlapping magisteria. And I mean, it's interesting when you think that the script writers for this comedy series are reading Rocks of Ages and saying, how can we take these ideas and kind of make them entertaining and send them up in our comedy show. And at the very end of the episode called Lisa the Skeptic, a variety of things have happened, and science and religion have come into conflict with each other, and the judge issues a restraining order at the very end of the program. The restraining order insists that religion must remain 500 yards from science at all times, a kind of caricature of the non-overlapping magisteria. So a case can be made like this. There are Pulitzer Prizes that the oracles of science have won. They're on government bodies. They write in the New York Times, op-eds and so on. They just appear here and there, and their ideas have a way of trickling down and shaping public discourse and public perceptions of what science is all about. So, in various ways, the oracles of science function as our public face of science. So, this means that if you would like to know what science is about, they will tell you. What do they tell you? They will tell you that science is mainly about origins. This seems to be the most prominent and engaging topic in the scientific community. They will tell you that scientists are all atheists or agnostics, and sometimes even hostile to religion. And they will tell you that science is incompatible with religion. These are themes that run quite consistently throughout their writing. Now, this, of course, is not true, as we know, that science is not mainly about origin. Scientists are not all atheists and agnostics. So when they preach this particular message here, they are promoting the religion of scientism rather than the proper and restrained view of science as one particularly effective way of knowing. If we were to do a more careful study about what science is really like, by not wandering into a local bookstore perhaps, but maybe going to boring scientific meetings and reading the technical scientific literature, we would find out that science is not mainly about origins, and you can pick up any scientific magazine, and most of the articles are not about the origin of something. Origins is a relatively minor topic in regular mainstream science. Scientists, we would discover, are not interested in talking about religion and the religious implications of their work. I mean, you would not naturally find discussions of religion at a chemistry conference any more than you would find it at a baseball game. It's just not on the table, not because they're all hostile and they've agreed to leave it off the table, but because they just don't care. That's not what they're there to talk about. They're not interested in relating their work to religion. They may be deeply religious themselves, but they're in a context where this is simply of no relevance. And surveys show that there's a fair amount of religious belief in the scientific community. And the most publicized survey back in the 90s that Larry Witham and Ed Larson did showed that some 40% of the members of the AAAS were not only religious, but religious in a fairly conservative way. I mean, this is a fairly conservative view here, that they believe in a God to whom one may pray in expectation of receiving an answer. And the number who would have a more deistic view of God would be even higher. So this is the actual characteristics of the scientific community. Now, in contrast, so if we look at the oracles of science and we say, well, what are their views on religion? E.O. Wilson is the only one who has a smattering of religious belief kind of left over from his childhood days as a good Southern Baptist boy in Alabama. He concedes that some of the remarkable fine-tuning of the universe is very suggestive, and he wonders if there might be some sort of a cosmic mind behind that, but he sees that as a question for the physicists to answer. He does not believe in a personal God or a God who intervenes, and in fact he believes that religious practice is a waste of time and we need to redirect the resources that we squander in our conventional religion to the worshiping of the evolutionary epic. In a very interesting interview with Robert Wright in his book Three Scientists and Their Gods, he uses this phrase, worship the evolutionary epic. Stephen Jay Gould tried to be a friend to religion. He thought that his non-overlapping magisteria might be a way for science and religion to get along, but he redefined religion in such a way that nobody could recognize it. So that peacemaking effort ended up being more impractical and naive and somewhat insulting. In his view, and he's happy to call himself an agnostic, religion is entirely about values. As long as religion never makes any factual statements of the sort like maybe God exists, that he's fine with religion as long as it's constrained to speak only of values. Hawking, of course, is incredibly cryptic. Nobody knows exactly what he thinks, and he's sold a lot of books by making interesting and difficult comments about religion. In Brief History of Time, he talks about God being a boundary condition, suggests that maybe when the physicists set up their equations that there's a little piece or two that's missing, and maybe we could call God the boundary conditions to make the equation work here. Hard to imagine how this God could play any meaningful role in religion. The doxology would certainly seem strange, to praise the boundary condition from whom all blessings flow. When we get to Sagan, we find aggressive criticism of religion. It was mitigated a little bit toward the end of his life as he tried to enlist the help of religious people in environmental causes, but most of his writing is very dismissive, seeing religion as nothing but unfounded superstition. When we get to Weinberg, we now see the what we're calling the new atheism in the States, that religion is not only untrue and unrecommended, but it's evil. It's a sinister force, so it's not benign. He said in a review of one of John Polkinghorne's book that if you see a good person doing something evil, you can be sure that it's because of their religion. It's the only thing, he said, that can make good people do bad things. And then, of course, Dawkins has assumed a central role in this new organization called the Brights. The atheists have decided that they're getting bad press, and the word atheism kind of has negative connotations, so they want to rehabilitate their public image by calling themselves Brights. And they're engaged in a campaign now, sort of like the gay community did some years ago when they didn't want to be called homosexual anymore, so they managed to change the vocabulary that we use, and now they're gay. So atheists now want to be called Brights, which I suppose by inference makes people who believe in God, which would include many of us, dims there. But you can go to the brights.net web page and see the program here. And religion, as he argued in a television special here a couple of years ago, is the root of not just some evils, but all of them. Now, at first pass, the oracles of science present an anti-religious face. But I want to suggest that it's not really anti-religious, it's just differently religious. So we have this sort of politically correct language that we use in the States where nobody can ever have a real disability. You can only be challenged in certain ways. So let's just suggest that that it's not that they fail to understand religion. They're just religiously challenged. So to do this, we have to kind of step back and say, well, let's look at religion in broader brushstrokes, not a particular religion, but just religion in general, so that we can see the connection between what traditional religions say and what they are saying. So to do this, if you want to talk about religion like without content, you go to Harvard Divinity School. They have religion there in its most generic form. So this is Kaufman, Gordon Kaufman, who has written a book in face of mystery called A Constructive Theology, in which he kind of wants to start sort of with nothing and then and build a new religion. And so in this book, and I have to kind of just summarize it in a caricature sort of way here, but he lists some of the characteristics of religions in terms of why everybody wants to be religious. So there's a certain universality to religious experience. The number of people truly comfortable with nothing resembling religion in their life is actually quite small. So he says, well, what is this? What is this need that religion fills? And this is what E.O. Wilson is alluding to when he said we need to worship the evolutionary epic. He said, here's Southern Baptist religion. It's all wrong, but we have to be religious, so let's just kind of trade the Southern Baptist ideas for these ones that we get from biology. So Kaufman says, what is this that religion does for us? So he suggests that religion is important to people because it provides a story for how we get here, gives us some kind of a creation account. In fact, this is exactly what the BBC guy working on that special talked to me about today. It's a story about these creation narratives and why do we need to have them. Religion assigns us, any religious person, a place in the story. So we're not just afterthoughts. We become a part of the story. We become at home in this grand scheme of things. And religion tells us what we should do, gives us some kind of ethical directives. And so this is why everybody wants to be religious, because we need these things. We have a certain kind of lostness without them. And so Kaufman says theology should kind of begin with this recognition and then kind of look at what are wholesome and effective ways to plug content into these stories. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have straightforward answers to these. No doubt they were occurring to you as I put them up there. But where did everything come from? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is the story that has sustained the Christian tradition. Well, E.O. Wilson says that we should replace this with the evolutionary epic. The evolutionary epic is probably the best myth we will ever have. Then he goes on to make this interesting claim here, the mythopoeic requirements of the mind. So he's acknowledging, as somebody who's thought a lot about human psychology and the way it shapes our pursuits, that we have these mythopoeic requirements, and these have to be met, but we should meet them with scientific materialism. We should learn how to worship in a materialist way, and then reinvest these energies that are currently being squandered in conventional religion. If we ask the question, who are we and where did we come from? Again, we have the story that we are created in the image of God, a very ambiguous but rich source of theological speculation over the centuries. But Sagan suggests that we are the local embodiment of a cosmos grown to self-awareness. Very eloquent, his language that he uses here. Our loyalties, he said, are to the species and to the planet. Our obligation to survive is owed to the cosmos, ancient and vast, from which we spring. Very, very theological sounding language, and filled with sort of ethical directives and so on. Like, I mean, what does this mean exactly, to be loyal to the species? How can we have an obligation to survive? I mean, he's pulling overtly religious and ethical language into what the reader thinks is a straightforward scientific exposition. How should we live? 10 Commandments, and there's a bunch more there if you read around. This has been one source of ethical directives. Sermon on the Mount gives us a statement about Christian values and so on. But we have the same kind of language that occurs in the writings of Weinberg and others. Weinberg, in a very eloquent passage at the end of the first 3 minutes. This is a grand book. If you haven't read this book, I recommend it. It's very, very short. And with the very end of it, he becomes quite poetic, and he's riding in an airplane, looking down at clouds and roads below the clouds and so on. And he talks about how marvelous the world seems, but how, if you really look at it closely, it's hostile. The more the universe seems comprehensible, he said, the more it seems pointless. So it makes this eloquent lament about the pointlessness of existence, but then he sort of says we can rescue ourselves from all this by doing science. The effort to understand the universe is one of the few things that lifts human life a little above the level of farce and gives it some of the grace of tragedy. Okay, not a dramatic promotion, but some improvement there to be working on a tragedy instead of a farce. Now, in all of their writings, and it almost always occurs, this is what Mary Midgley calls the chapter 7 effect or something like that, but it always occurs kind of toward the end of the book. Like these books kind of give a straightforward exposition of science. It's clear and articulate and not overly philosophical. And then when they get to the end, they need to say something about what it all means. And so the exposition kind of morphs at that point, and they go into this quasi-theological mode and start talking about things like this. This kind of rhetoric is completely missing for the first 90% of the book, but this is literally on the next to the last page. He begins to raise these kinds of questions. Now, these what does it all mean conclusions communicate certain important things about science to people who don't understand science very well. So if you read an interesting book and you're taken along this path by the author, you like what you're reading, you respect the author, and you wonder, well, what does this all mean as you're reflecting on it, and you get to the end, and then they tell you. You are going to think, and I think very innocently, that the point of everything that you've done so far in the book is now explained in this kind of finale. So it's not unreasonable to think that Weinberg, who clearly understands a lot about cosmology, is making an actual point here that does follow. Now, it's the purpose of conferences like this to have conversations where we understand that this doesn't follow, but that's a complicated argument, an argument that many people are going to miss. So there are some very significant people in the States, and probably over here as well, who simply have missed this. They have taken the conclusions to these books at face value and drawn what they believe is a faithful inference, and I would say it is a faithful inference. That Philip Johnson is one of them. He's the fellow that started the intelligent design movement some years ago with this book, Darwin on Trial, and has since published a set of books. But in Darwin on Trial, he says science is based on philosophical naturalism, not data. Evolution, he says, is promoted to persuade the public to believe that there's no purposeful intelligence that transcends the natural world. Now, he got these ideas from Richard Dawkins. He was on a sabbatical here in London in the 80s, relatively new Christian, went into a bookstore, purchased The Blind Watchmaker, and found that on every other page of this book, Dawkins seemed to be assaulting the traditional creation story. And as a lawyer, familiar with rhetorical analysis, and a very bright guy, he began to feel like the claims which are being made in this book are not really scientific claims, that this seems to be an anti-religious polemic. It doesn't seem to be a straightforward scientific exposition. Now, this, I think, is a woefully inadequate view of science, but it is not an unreasonable inference to take out of The Blind Watchmaker. Now, if he had started with Mariano's The Mind of the Universe, perhaps instead he might have not launched the intelligent design movement. But starting as he did, it's very easy to see how he ended up very, very concerned about what science was doing with its replacement creation stories. Now, this guy here is doing all kinds of dreadful mischief now in the States. This is Ken Ham. A couple of years ago, he opened a $27 million creation museum in Kentucky, and it has succeeded beyond his wildest dreams. Hundreds of thousands of people are paying $20 a piece to come in and see his science museum, which explains how the Earth is 6,000 years old, that dinosaurs were contemporary with human beings, and so on. He's very, very influential, and you would have no idea how many evangelical Christians sit in Sunday school classes in the United States and watch videos where this guy unfolds this bizarre anti-scientific view of natural history. He has a very nice glossy magazine with a circulation of about 60,000. This is a magazine that, despite the troubled times of print media, is actually growing in size, growing in circulation, and being published more often. It's a beautiful, gorgeous magazine, filled with stories about how the first few chapters in Genesis are scientific accounts. His book, Evolution, the Lie, is a kind of a mini classic in the anti-scientific literature. And he even has a whole ministry to children. So if you want to learn little cute songs to teach your children to make them disbelieve in evolution and the Big Bang, you can get a CD for them to sing. This is the little poems in here and so on, showing dinosaurs getting off of Noah's Ark and so on. So there's a whole kind of program here that kind of starts with things for children, with curriculum that you can use in your home school and Christian school, going all the way up to what looks like a sort of pseudo-science magazine. If you lay this magazine kind of alongside Discover magazine, they look a little bit like each other, but then when you start reading, you realize just how little overlap they actually have. He takes the evolutionary story and casts it in apocalyptic terms. On the back cover of The Lie, he writes, the Bible prophetically warns that in the last days false teachers will introduce destructive lies among the people. This comes from the New Testament out of Peter. Their purpose, these false teachers, their purpose is to bring God's truth into disrepute and to exploit believers by telling them made-up and imagined stories. This lie is now among us. That lie is evolution. So he makes a claim that Peter is actually referring to evolutionists like Richard Dawkins when it mentions false teachers that will introduce destructive lies among the people. Now, if Ken Ham and Philip Johnson were two lone crusaders, Don Quixotes trying to overturn mainstream science, then perhaps we could ignore them, but we can't. There's a gigantic literature. This movement is just huge. This is the book that almost made it into the Dover Public Schools, and I guess our journalist at the airport was going to talk about this a little bit. So is it no chance he will make it? No. So I hope he shows up, because I really hope we get to hear what he had to say. But there's huge numbers of books, and you can go into any library in any evangelical church, and all these books are there. You can go into any Christian bookstore, and typically any Christian bookstore, any Protestant Christian bookstore, I should say. The Catholic ones are a little bit better, but any Protestant Christian bookstore will have loads and loads of books which are strongly anti-science. You will hunt in vain for a pro-science book. There might be one or two that you could find, because some have appeared over the years, but for the most part, the books are all hostile to science, like these books here are. And this is just a publishing industry. There's millions and millions of dollars in this. Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis organization has some 200 employees, a budget of like $10 million a year. I mean, it's like a small university with a single-minded goal to get rid of evolution. So this isn't going away at all, and in fact, this has reached the point where it's not even close to being a scientific conversation anymore. This is a part of what we call the culture wars in America, which is all about like who gets to say who we are, who gets to tell the creation story for Americans. Now, in the book that I wrote before, Oracles of Science, my co-author and I make this case in here that this is the first step to understanding evolution, is to move it out of science and place it in a cultural context, so we understand what the word evolution means. A lot of biologists don't understand this, because for them evolution has a narrow scientific meaning, but the person on the street, when they hear the word evolution, does not think of a biological theory about mutation and natural selection. They think of an atheistic alternative to the biblical creation story. This particular controversy is actually fought on bumpers. This is kind of the level at which it's gone. So, like, this is the familiar Jesus fish, and one of my students went to grad school and sent me this Darwin fish, the new and improved one that's evolving now, growing legs there. But then there's a truth fish that can eat the Darwin fish there. But then there's also a Darwin fish that can eat the Jesus fish. And then some irreverent pundit has created this one here, which I'm just not sure exactly what we should make of that, but I usually don't leave that up too long. So we replace it with this one here for evangelical audiences. So this is kind of the competition here, kind of like it's like at this level. I mean, as if we just automatically know in advance, right, that Jesus and Darwin, or at least Darwin's ideas, have to be juxtaposed in this particular way. Now, this is a very, very popular cartoon that Ken Ham has produced. He made a first version of this ages ago, and it was so popular that it's now a poster in color that lots of high school students have in their bedroom. But it's very interesting to look at what Ken Ham has done here with this. There's a lot in this. So this is the argument, the anti-evolutionary argument that he outlines in his book, and it's basically the same argument that appears in all of the creationist literature. There's a kind of a standard package of arguments. It's a kind of a combination of social arguments, scientific arguments, and biblical and theological arguments all woven together. So Ham says that this is all about foundations. Now, Christianity, Ken Ham says, should be founded on the doctrine of creation. He starts there, not with Jesus and the incarnation, but it starts with creation. His organization is called Answers in Genesis. So we start here with creation, or we start here with evolution. We have the absolute truth of God's Word, or the relativism of our own epistemology here. Now, here's how the war is fought. If you are shrewd, like the evolutionists are, you try to dismantle the foundation. And so you shoot everyone systematically at the truth of God's Word. You try to dismantle the Bible, and knowing that everything that's built on that will come crashing down. But the Christians don't get this. So he's trying to rally Christians around his cause. The Christians are sleeping, some of them. Some of them are shooting at each other there. So, people like Ken Miller and I that criticize Ken Ham, this is us here. Some of them are shooting at their own foundations there. Now this guy here, who's actually doing something useful, like he's actually exploded one of these balloons up here. So, this was drugs or reality TV or something up there that you think is horrible, has been destroyed. But no one understands that you've really got to shoot at evolution and dismantle this foundation here. Now, all of these bad things and a whole host of other ones have all arisen because of evolution. That if it weren't for Darwin and his ideas, and there are pre-Darwinian evolutionary ideas that play into this as well, but if it were not for our embrace of evolution and its implications, we wouldn't be racist, we wouldn't think euthanasia was a good idea, our families would be more secure, gays would be back in the closet, we wouldn't have so much pornography, abortion and so on, all of these evils. And they make this, it's a very specious, fluffy argument, as you can imagine, but they make this argument that all of these evil things are the result of evolution. Now, of course, who wouldn't be concerned about a idea which gave birth to all of these things? I mean, if we were absolutely convinced that evolution made us racist, then perhaps we would look at it a little bit differently. But as we know, that's not the case. So this is a very, very popular kind of summary of how this plays out. And for everybody who has ever read a science book, there probably are 50 people that have this poster hanging in their room or their church. So Ken Ham and Philip Johnson, I think, are natural cultural responses to the oracles of science. Like, I don't think they're eccentric and incomprehensible. I think it's only natural that a deeply religious, somewhat anti-intellectual culture like America would produce some response to these guys who are all so unfriendly to faith. Now, this raises a very interesting question. I don't have an answer to this, but why is this? Like, I mean, if it is indeed the case that these 6 individuals are consistently unfriendly to faith, why is that the case? I mean, the scientific community as a whole isn't. If you picked scientists at random, just took the directory of the AAAS and picked 6 people at random, it's very likely that 3 of them would believe in God, and it would be most likely that there wouldn't be a one of them that would want to go on an anti-religious tirade. So why is it that the most popular ones do? Is there something about the anti-religious tirade that has made them into public figures? I'm sure that's a part of it. It's always interesting to have conflict, and people like Dawkins are aggressive and acerbic, and it's fun to quote him. But he had these beliefs as a young person. And he in the selfish gene and so on. It began very early on, before he was a major public intellectual. So they didn't sort of embrace these beliefs just because they were on their way to becoming a public intellectual. So it's a very interesting kind of sociological question, this selection process that's going on here. I mean, if we were to try to put more faith-friendly faces up there, I mean, these would be candidates here. I mean, this is Ken Miller. He's certainly friendly to faith, but he's certainly not of the same sort of stature as Dawkins. I'm not sure he could appear on The Simpsons and people would know who he was. Francis Collins is probably emerging, I think, as a public intellectual of sufficient notoriety that probably you could imagine him on a television show and people would know that, oh, this was the genome guy. John Barrow, again, a thinker that very deep, written a lot of important books. Owen Gingrich, John Polkinghorne, Paul Davies. I mean, these are certainly all people that, to differing degrees, Davies being sort of a deist, Collins and Ken Miller being pretty conventional, they could be faith-friendly alternatives to science, but they just don't have the public face to be sufficiently influential. So that's just a question that I sort of lay out there. At some point, it would be nice to think that you could have a faith-friendly scientific voice that would appear on The Simpsons. In hopes that might happen, I have myself Simpsonized there. So maybe someday I'll get to be on The Simpsons, and they'll devote an episode to the oracles of science, which would make Oxford happy, so they could sell more books, probably. To conclude this, I'm not sure where this conversation is going in the United States. I mean, it's very difficult to see how any real progress is being made here, that there's kind of a glorious and grand scientific community that's doing wonderful things and is certainly respected at some level, but the number of evangelicals who are fearful of science is gigantic, and the number of publicly relevant evangelicals, people like Rick Warren and Chuck Colson and so on. I mean, these influential leaders are, for the most part, hostile to science. Now, they wouldn't say that they were, but in the embrace of an anti-scientific position, they're really very hostile to mainstream science. So it's hard to kind of see how we're going to get out of this mess that we're in. Just very, very difficult to imagine that. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, Francis Collins and myself and a couple other people have launched a new project called BioLogos that you may have seen some news about. This is going to try to be a faith-friendly alternative, but it's we have no idea whether we'll just kind of upset everyone that's a little bit to the left of us because we're too conservative, and everyone to the right of us because we're too liberal. And we're a tiny project compared to Ken Ham and his $10 million shop there at Answers in Genesis, and the Discovery Institute with their deep pockets, the intelligent design movement, and so on. So who knows if that will be successful or not. But we desperately need something like this to emerge so that somehow our scientific picture and our religious pictures can kind of come together. So if I can take a 1-minute indulgence, I just want to tell you something about Mariano that I don't think anybody in this room knows. In the little booklet, biographical booklet in your packets here, there's a picture of Mariano and I, and Raphael is in there, and Don Yerxa, my co-author from Species of Origins, which is this book here. Mariano came to Boston and said, I've got an editor at Oxford University Press interested in this book. Do you want to co-author it with me? And of course, any academic who knows that the door is halfway open at Oxford University Press is going to say, yes, I do. So I said, sure, I would love to do this. And so we began this collaboration, exchanged a lot of emails, had to get a book proposal ready, and so on. But this was very much Mariano's project. I mean, he was the one that had the editor at Oxford. He had sat down with her and proposed this idea. And he wrote the first drafts of most of the chapters in the book. And he was the contact with Oxford all the way through. And at the very last minute, and you know from the history of this that he received a copy of this actually in the hospital as he was dying. But at the very last minute, when he sent in the final version of the manuscript without having said a word to me, all of a sudden I was the first author on this project. And if I had had a different kind of relationship with Mariano, I would have said, why did you do that? But I knew he was ill, and I thought, well, he probably knows that he doesn't have a lot of time left, and being first author on a book won't be as big a deal to him as it would be to me then. So he swapped our names around, and I thought that was just a kind of a marvelous statement about what kind of a wonderful human being Artigas was, and how privileged we were to know him and what a wonderful opportunity it was to collaborate with him on a book. Okay, thank you.